It began with a single note so faint I thought I'd imagined it. The wind was still, the air biting with the sting of oncoming snow. I had been sitting in my living room, the soft glow of Christmas lights casting fractured shadows on the walls, when the sound drifted through the cracks of my old window panes. At first, it blended with the ambient quiet of the neighborhood, a soft, distant melody that barely rose above the sound of my own breathing. But then it grew louder. I moved to the window, tugging back the curtain with hesitant fingers. Outside, the street lay blanketed in frost, the Christmas lights of my neighbors' houses glowing faintly under the heavy sky. And there, at the far end of the cul-de-sac, were the singers. They stood in the deep shadows between two houses, cloaked in darkness except for the warm flicker of their candles. Their song was a carol, one I'd heard 100 times before, but there was something wrong about it. The melody was stretched, the harmony dissonant. It sent a chill skittering across my skin, though I couldn't explain why. They moved slowly down the street, their steps synchronized, their movements precise. The figures, 6 or 7, it was hard to tell in the dim light, were indistinct, their features blurred by the haze of candle smoke and the failing visibility of the winter night. I pressed my face closer to the window, my breath fogging the glass as I watched them pause at the porch of the Petersons' house. The song rose in volume, filling the street with a strange lilting cadence. Their voices blended seamlessly, but there was no joy in the tune, no warmth, just an eerie, somber echo that seemed to stretch into the bones of the night. The Petersons' porch light flickered on, and the door creaked open. I could just make out old Mr. Peterson's silhouette as he peered outside, his head tilting in curiosity at the visitors. He hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward, disappearing into the shadows of the singers. And just like that, the song stopped. The silence that followed was oppressive, the kind that makes you hyper-aware of every breath, every heartbeat. The carolers turned as one, their candles glowing faintly like tiny wavering stars, and moved to the next house. Mr. Peterson was gone. I told myself he must have stepped back inside, but when I glanced again at the porch, the light had gone out. I stayed at the window long after the carolers had passed, their song fading into the distance. The frost on the glass felt colder than before, almost seeping through, and the Christmas lights on my tree suddenly seemed dimmer. That night, I dreamed of music. The morning was eerily quiet, the usual hum of neighborhood activity conspicuously absent. My breath hung in the icy air as I stepped onto my porch, my boots crunching against the thin layer of frost that coated everything. Across the street, the Petersons' house stood in stoic silence, its windows dark and unwelcoming. I hadn't seen Mr. Peterson's car in the driveway, nor had I heard the telltale squeak of his garage door opening. That in itself was unusual. He was a creature of habit, always out for coffee at 7 a.m., his old sedan rumbling down the street like clockwork. The unease from the night before clung to me like a second skin. I decided to check on him. Crossing the street, I couldn't help but glance at the other houses, wondering if anyone else had seen the carolers or heard their haunting song. But every window was shut tight, every curtain drawn. A blanket of silence hung over the street, thick and impenetrable. I knocked on Mr. Peterson's door, the sound loud and jarring in the quiet morning. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. I tried the doorknob. It turned easily, the door swinging inward with a groan that sent shivers down my spine. "Mr. Peterson?" I called, stepping into the dimly lit hallway. The air inside was stale and unnaturally cold, and I immediately regretted my decision. The house was eerily still. The furniture sat as it always did, the faint scent of coffee lingering in the kitchen, but there was no sign of him. I ventured further inside, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. And then I saw him. He was slumped in his armchair in the living room, his head tilted back at an unnatural angle. His face was frozen in an expression of pure terror, his mouth agape as if caught mid-scream. I staggered back, choking on a gasp. My pulse thundered in my ears as I stumbled out of the house, nearly slipping on the icy steps in my haste to get away. By the time the authorities arrived, I had managed to compose myself enough to explain what I'd seen. But even as I recounted the details, I couldn't bring myself to mention the carolers or their eerie song. That night, as I sat by my window, I heard them again. The melody was faint at first, carried on the icy wind. But as the hours crept toward midnight, it grew louder, more insistent. The voices rose in an unsettling harmony, echoing through the quiet street like a ghostly refrain. And then I saw them, their flickering candles bobbing in the darkness as they moved from house to house. This time, they stopped in front of mine. They were at my doorstep. I stood frozen behind the curtain, my heart pounding against my ribs as their song reached its crescendo. The sound was unlike anything I had ever heard, melodic yet fractured, haunting in its dissonance. Their voices reverberated through the walls as though the house itself was absorbing their eerie tune. I didn't dare move. The carolers remained on the porch, their flickering candles casting shifting shadows through the frosted glass of the door. From where I stood, I could see them more clearly now. Their cloaks were tattered, their outlines jagged and indistinct. Their faces were hidden beneath deep hoods, but something about the way they moved, the precision of their synchrony, made my skin crawl. One of them raised a gloved hand and knocked. The sound was soft but deliberate, echoing in the stillness of my house. I backed away, my breath catching in my throat. The knock came again, and this time it was louder, sharper, more insistent. "Go away," I whispered, though the words felt meaningless. The song stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so heavy it felt suffocating. My hands trembled as I reached for the phone, dialing the number for the police. The call went unanswered. The line buzzed faintly before cutting off altogether. I stared at the phone in disbelief, cold dread pooling in my stomach. Outside, the carolers remained motionless. Then, as one, they turned and stepped off my porch. Their candles bobbed faintly as they moved down the street, their song resuming in a slow, mournful cadence. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, the Petersons' death was the talk of the town. The official report was vague, heart failure, they said, but something about it didn't sit right with me. That look on Mr. Peterson's face, the way his features were frozen in sheer terror. It wasn't natural. I needed answers. I spent the day at the library, combing through records and old newspapers in a growing haze of unease. At first, I found nothing out of the ordinary, just mundane archives of town meetings, real estate transfers, and school events. But then, buried in a box of brittle clippings, I stumbled upon a story that made my blood run cold. It was an article from 1873, written in the stilted prose of the time. "Mysterious Disappearances on Christmas Eve," the headline read. Beneath it was an account of a strange event in our town nearly 150 years ago. A group of carolers, it said, had gone missing during a particularly harsh winter. The townsfolk had organized search parties, but the carolers were never found. Days later, stories began to circulate of a ghostly choir roaming the streets, their song carrying a strange and deadly curse. Each household they visited suffered the loss of one family member within days. The legend had been passed down through generations, its details growing murkier with time. Some dismissed it as a cautionary tale meant to dissuade children from wandering into the snow. But others whispered of strange happenings on Christmas Eve, of unearthly singing and shadows that lingered too long. A sudden chill prickled at the back of my neck. The description matched the carolers I'd seen almost perfectly. And their song, wasn't finished. That night, the carolers returned. Their song began faintly, a haunting echo that seemed to rise from the earth itself. I could hear it even through the walls, its melody threading its way into every corner of my home. The sound was wrong. Notes stretched and warped into something alien and malevolent. They were closer this time. I stayed in the living room, every light in the house blazing. I'd locked the doors and windows, triple-checking each one, but it didn't feel like enough. The carolers' song grew louder, and soon the flicker of their candles was visible through the curtains. And then, as before, the knocking started. It wasn't a polite knock this time. The sound was sharp and rhythmic, pounding against the door in time with their song. I pressed my back against the wall, my pulse hammering in my ears as I tried to make myself as small as possible. "Leave me alone," I whispered, but the knocking didn't stop. The air in the house grew heavy, cold seeping through the walls despite the crackling fire in the hearth. My breath came in shallow gasps, the chill wrapping around me like a vice. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to think. They couldn't come in unless I let them. I repeated this to myself like a mantra, trying to drown out the growing panic. But the knocking grew louder, more insistent, the door frame rattling with each impact. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing them to leave. And then, abruptly, it stopped. The silence was deafening. I opened my eyes slowly, my ears straining for any sign of movement. The carolers were gone, or so I thought. The candles had been extinguished, but their faint scent lingered in the air, a mix of wax and pine, tinged with something acrid. The stillness was almost worse than the song, pressing against me like a physical weight. And then I heard it, a soft, melodic hum. It wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the house. My chest tightened as the realization set in. The carolers' song had found a way in, threading through the cracks in the walls and the locks on the doors. The melody wove its way through the house, its haunting refrain growing louder, closer. I turned toward the hallway, and my breath caught in my throat. The shadow of a figure stood at the end of the corridor, motionless but unmistakable. It wasn't holding a candle, yet its form seemed to flicker and shift, its edges blurred as though it were caught between two worlds. And then it began to move toward me. The figure moved with a strange gliding motion, its outline wavering like smoke caught in a draft. The dim light of the room seemed to recoil from its presence, pooling in shadows that stretched unnaturally long. My legs felt like lead, the primal urge to flee at war with the crushing weight of terror that held me in place. Its song grew louder as it advanced, no longer a melody, but a fragmented wail, disjointed and discordant. The sound was everywhere, burrowing into my ears, filling my head with an oppressive rhythm that thudded like a second heartbeat. I stumbled backward, clutching at the arm of the couch for balance. "What do you want?" I rasped, my voice raw and trembling. The figure stopped abruptly, as if it had heard me. For a moment, the humming ceased, replaced being a silence so absolute it felt alive. Then it spoke, not in words, but in sound, a hollow, echoing moan that seemed to crawl through my skull. Beneath its cadence, I heard something darker, 1,000 whispers layered in a chaotic murmur. The air thickened with each syllable, and I gasped for breath as the room seemed to shrink around me. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement, more shadows, more figures. They emerged from the walls, slipping free from the edges of reality like ink seeping into water. Each carried the same flickering absence of light, their forms wrapped in the black, shifting smoke that blurred their edges. The carolers were in my home. Desperation clawed at me. My gaze darted to the fireplace, where a poker leaned against the brick. It was a foolish instinct, but I lunged for it, gripping the cold metal tightly. The song resumed, rising in pitch until it became a shrill, agonizing keening. My ears burned with the sound, and the room swam in and out of focus. "Get out!" I screamed, swinging the poker wildly. The sharp metallic clang as it struck the wall echoed like a gunshot in the suffocating quiet. The carolers didn't flinch. They stepped closer, the glow of their candles absent now, replaced by an unnatural luminescence that pulsed from within their shrouded forms. The figure at the forefront reached out, its hand stretching toward me. The limb was impossibly long, its fingers ending in sharp, jagged points that gleamed like frost under a winter moon. My heart thundered in my chest as I swung again, the poker slicing through the shadowy form without resistance. The figure paused, its head tilting in a motion that was almost curious. Then, slowly, it leaned forward, and though it had no visible eyes, I felt its gaze pierce through me. The whispers intensified. They were in my head now, slithering through my thoughts like worms burrowing into soft earth. I heard my name repeated over and over in voices that weren't mine, voices that bled with sorrow and fury, and something far older. "You sang with us." The words coalesced, an anguished hiss that froze my blood. "Now we sing for you." The shadows surged, closing the distance in a heartbeat. Their forms wrapped around me like a storm, and the world tilted as I fell to the ground, the coldness of the floor biting into my skin. The song swallowed me whole, each note pulling me deeper into a void I couldn't escape. Memories surfaced unbidden, flashes of my life replayed in sharp, vivid fragments. My childhood laughter on Christmas morning, the warmth of my mother's embrace, the lonely ache of loss when she was gone. The moments unspooled like frayed threads, each one unraveling into the unending harmony of the caroler's haunting melody. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. I opened my eyes to find myself alone in the living room. The air was still, the lights dimmed to a faint, flickering glow. My body ached as though I'd been dragged through freezing water, my limbs heavy and unresponsive. But the silence was worse. It pressed against me like a physical weight, suffocating in its completeness. The carolers were gone, or at least I thought they were. The scent of wax and pine lingered faintly in the air, a ghostly reminder of their presence. I staggered to my feet, gripping the edge of the couch for support. My gaze drifted to the window, where a thin layer of frost had crept over the glass. Written in the frost were 3 words, carved in jagged, uneven lines: "We will return." The next morning, the town awoke to another tragedy. The Andersons, 2 doors down, were found lifeless in their home, their faces etched with the same frozen terror that had haunted Mr. Peterson. And I knew the truth then, as I know it now. The caroler's song is never truly finished. I hear it still, sometimes faintly, just at the edge of hearing. A single note, a half-whispered refrain that sends a shiver down my spine. They are waiting for me, their melody winding through the cold winter nights, promising they will come again. Because once you hear their song, it's only a matter of time before you join the choir.